or be guilty, recording in progress, or be guilty of any lewd or indecent act or behavior, or shall exhibit or perform any indecent, immoral, or lewd play, or other representation, he should be guilty of a misdemeanor, and on conviction shall pay a fine not exceeding $500. So as this sort of bulky legal text suggests, the Board of Supervisors did not criminalize cross-dressing as a distinct offense, but rather as one manifestation of this broader offense of indecency, alongside public nudity, indecent exposure, lewd acts, and immoral performances. In turn, this wide-ranging indecency law was not a standalone prohibition, but one part of a new chapter of the municipal codebook, which was the local law book, entitled Offenses Against Good Morals and Decency, which also criminalized public drunkenness, using vulgar language in public, and my favorite one, bathing in the bay without appropriate clothing. In fact, alongside these newly designated crimes, cross-dressing was one of the very first offenses against good morals and decency to be outlawed in the city. Despite its roots in indecency law, San Francisco's cross-dressing law soon became a really flexible tool for policing multiple gender transgressions. And by the end of the 19th century, over 100 people had been arrested for this crime. A wide variety of people fell foul of the law, including feminist dress reformers, female impersonators, fast young women who like to dress as up as a man for a night out on the town, and people whose gender identifications did not match the sex they were assigned at birth. People who today, perhaps, though by no means definitely, would identify as trans or non-binary. Those arrested faced police harassment, public exposure, and up to 6 months in jail, which was the maximum sentence permitted under state law. By the late 19th century, cross-dressing offenders also risked psychiatric institutionalization or deportation if they were not a US citizen. In October 1890, for example, a judge sent a person who alternately used the names Dick Rubel or Mammy Rubel to the state insane asylum for wearing men's clothing on a body that the judge deemed female. In court, Rubel disputed this gender assignment, explaining to the judge, "I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, I have no sex at all." Now, to the judge, this was clear evidence of insanity, and he sent Rubel to the Stockton Insane Asylum. Here, the admitting doctor noted that Rubel, quote, imagines she is a hermaphrodite, wears male clothing, wishes to have legal authority to wear men's clothing. Such evidence of insanity doomed Rubel to life in the asylum. They remained there for 18 years before dying of tuberculosis in 1908. Around the same time as Rubel's death, a Mexican-American child named Geraldine Portica was growing up in San Francisco, living as a girl, even though she had been assigned male at birth. When Portica reached adulthood in 1917, police arrested her under cross-dressing law for wearing women's clothing on a body they judged to be male. Upon arrest, the police took this photograph, and it's accompanied by a handwritten caption which reveals her legal fate. That handwritten caption is up here. It says, "This is not a girl, but a boy who was reared by his mother as a girl and has always dressed as a girl and went to school as a girl and has never associated with anyone else but girls and was employed as a chambermaid on 6th Street when arrested. He is a native of Mexico and speaks several languages, his English with the Spanish accent. He's now waiting to be deported to Mexico by the US government, December 27th, 1917. So San Francisco's cross-dressing law marked the start of a new regulatory approach towards gender transgressions in the city, and it attempted to kind of draw and fix the boundary between normative and non-normative gender during a period of rapid social change. However, cross-dressing law not only signaled a new object of regulation, but also a new mechanism of regulation: exclusion from public space. From its inception, cross-dressing law was specifically concerned with public gender displays, and it targeted cross-dressing in public places. Notably, the law did not criminalize cross-dressing in private places, but instead produced a kind of public-private divide through which cross-dressing could be managed. For example, in the 1890s, a San Franciscan who identified as a woman named Jenny reported that although she preferred to wear women's clothing, she only dared do so in private for fear of arrest on the city streets because legally she was male. In a letter to the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, Jenny wrote, "Only because of the arbitrary actions of the police do I wear men's clothing outside of the house. Skirts are a sanctuary to me, and I would rather keep on women's clothing forever if it were allowed on the street." Consequently, cross-dressing law did much more than police the types of clothing, that ostensibly belonged to each sex. Instead, it also used the visible marker of clothing to police the types of people that belonged in public space. So in policing the terms of urban belonging, cross-dressing law dovetailed with numerous other local laws, also concerned with the public visibility of what I call problem bodies, particularly those of Chinese immigrants, prostitutes, and those who were deemed maimed, deformed, or diseased. And I want to review some of these laws quickly with you now. So some of these laws sought to directly exclude problem bodies from public space. This was the case for cross-dressing law, as well as for an 1867 begging law that prohibited anyone who was maimed, deformed, diseased, or an otherwise unsightly or disgusting object from appearing in public. It was also the case for an 1869 law that banned people from carrying baskets on poles through city streets, which was a common way of moving through public space for some Chinese immigrant laborers. A second set of laws operated through confinement rather than exclusion, seeking to ban problem bodies from particular neighborhoods. So a series of laws in the 1880s and 1890s, for example, targeted houses of prostitution on middle-class residential streets, seeking to confine prostitution to a newly emerging and racialized vice district. A third type of legal intervention required the concealment of problem bodies from the respectable public's view. Specifically, in 1865, the chief of police attempted to reduce the visibility of prostitution in Chinatown by requiring crib owners to buy and erect large screens at the entrance of the streets that house them so as to, quote, hide the vice and degradation from women and children on the passing downtown streetcar. Finally, there were several legal attempts to bypass intra-city boundaries and remove problem bodies from the city entirely. These attempts were aimed exclusively at Chinese immigrants, and from the 1850s to the 1880s, there were numerous efforts to remove all Chinese residents from the city by declaring Chinatown a public nuisance. These attempts were ultimately unsuccessful, but an 1865 order to remove Chinese houses of ill fame from the city did succeed and resulted in the removal of 130 Chinese women in 1 year. Now, undoubtedly, there are really important differences between these laws, as well as between the processes through which cross-dressed, indecent, unsightly, and racialized immigrant bodies were defined as problems and targeted for legal intervention. However, I want to bring them these laws together here as they were brought together in the 19th century municipal code books for two main reasons. First, when these laws are considered together, it becomes clear that cross-dressing law was not alone in its attempt to minimize the public visibility of problem bodies, but was one part of a broader legal matrix that was also concerned with race, citizenship, and disease, as well as gender transgressions. Moreover, these were not independent concerns. For example, as many scholars have shown, accusations of sexual and gender deviance have frequently been deployed in processes of racialization, while racialized anxieties have informed the policing of gender and sex. In turn, gender, race, and sex have all been linked to disease, and in 19th century San Francisco, the management of public health was key to policing Chinese immigrants and prostitutes. In short, there were numerous intersecting cultural anxieties during this period that become much more apparent when cross-dressing law is situated in its broader legal context. Second, this broader context also makes clearer the ways that cross-dressing law was not only concerned with managing gender, but also with managing city space. According to the legal historian, Lawrence Friedman, 19th century municipal laws generally tolerated manifestations of vice as long as they remained in an underground state. However, before vice in San Francisco could remain in an underground state, such spaces had to be created. Laws that sought to reduce the public visibility of problem bodies, including cross-dressing law, were instrumental to this process, drawing a series of social and spatial boundaries within the city between public and private, visible and concealed, respectable and vice districts. In doing so, these laws not only used city space to police problem bodies, but also impacted the urban environment, imbuing particular spaces with racialized, sexualized, and gendered meanings. Policing problem bodies through spatial regulation, however, could have some ironic effects, inciting a kind of cultural fascination and a desire to see that entrepreneurs could then exploit. One manifestation of this was the popular slumming tour that guided tourists through the Barbary Coast and Chinatown to glimpse the bodies that the law sought to conceal, taking in brothels, opium dens, dive bars, and sick rooms housing Chinese patients who were banned from the city hospital. Another manifestation was the Dime Museum Freak Show, which rested on a different movement of problem bodies, from the street to the stage. And it's here, in the context of cross-dressing law, that the overlaps and tensions between regulation and fascination become most apparent. So similar to municipal law, the Dime Museum Freak Show was a key 19th century institution that was preoccupied with the public visibility of non-normative bodies. As a popular entertainment venue, it offered a variety of attractions for a low price, a dime, including human anatomy exhibits, lectures on morality, sideshow circus artists, and live freak show performers. There were several dime museums in San Francisco, the largest of which was the Pacific Museum of Anatomy and Science on Montgomery Street. Dime museum entertainment centered upon performances of bodily difference and paid particularly close attention to bodies that challenged gendered and racial boundaries, or ostensibly revealed the somatic penalties for immorality through spectacles of disease and deformity. For example, anatomy exhibits frequently included hermaphrodite bodies with particular focus on genitals, while live freak shows typically included a bearded lady. Another staple attraction was the popular Missing Link, or What Is It exhibit, which usually featured an African-American man or a white man in blackface who was presented as the missing link between man and animal. Many dime museums also featured pathology rooms that contained displays of diseased sexual organs and other body parts, ostensibly damaged by syphilis and gonorrhea and, quote, the filthy habit of self-abuse. Finally, dime museums regularly staged performances of racialized national dominance that corresponded to contemporary wars. Now, as with the municipal laws that I reviewed earlier, there were really important differences between these exhibits and the power struggles they dramatized. Nonetheless, I again bring them together here in my work as they were brought together under the Dime Museum roof to foreground the preoccupations with race, nation, and disease that contextualized freak show performances of cross-dressing. So as we can see, the law and the freak show shared a common set of cultural anxieties concerning the shifting boundaries of gender, race, disease, and the nation. However, the relationship between the two was complex, not least because the law prohibited the public visibility of problem bodies, while the freak show required their public display. To examine the tensions between these two different approaches to public visibility in the context of cross-dressing law, I'm now going to turn briefly to the story of a man called Milton Matson. So in early January 1895, a man named Milton Matson was arrested in San Francisco on Larkin Street in the room of his fiancée, Ellen Fairweather, and charged with obtaining money under false pretenses. Matson was taken to the San Jose County Jail and locked up in a cell with several other men for 2 weeks until the jailer received a telegram addressed to Louisa Matson, care of the county jail, and realized that Matson had been assigned female at birth and was legally female. After some complicated legal wrangling, charges against Matson were dropped, and he walked free from the jail in men's clothing, returning to San Francisco the following month. The exposure of Matson's true sex, as it was called by the newspapers, generated a mass of newspaper coverage, and the San Francisco dailies ran numerous stories on this male impersonator, or great pretender, as Matson was described. In these stories, the press excitedly debated the possibility of Matson's arrest under cross-dressing law, now that they had undermined his ability to live as a man. And they reported that Matson publicly dared the police to come and arrest him. Before this could happen, however, Matson was offered a job by a local dime museum to appear as a freak show exhibit, sitting on a platform in men's clothing for the public to view. And he accepted. Apparently, Matson's freak show performance was popular because several other local dime museums also began featuring cross-dress performers that were deceptively advertised as the only genuine Miss Matson in male attire. So as Matson's case reveals, the relationship between the law and the freak show was really complex. On the one hand, they operated according to very different logics. The law imprisoned, the freak show displayed. The law deprived its subjects, the freak show offered a salary. The law disapproved and sought to reduce its subjects' deviance, where the freak show was fascinated and sought to exaggerate and increase it. On the other hand, though, the operations of cross-dressing law and the freak show overlapped. Not only was Matson, like other freak show exhibits, recruited by a dime museum manager straight from a jail cell, but his participation in the exhibition regulated his cross-dressing in a very direct way. His contract forbade him to cross-dress on San Francisco streets so as to preserve the mystique and also the profitability of his show. Additionally, the hypervisibility of cross-dressing bodies within the freak show context could have disciplinary effects that extended far beyond those who were featured as exhibits, communicating to audiences in starkly visual terms the parameters of acceptable gender behavior and the penalties for violating those norms. And this point, I think, is really well illustrated by a popular dime novel from 1891 called A Florida Enchantment, in which a wealthy white woman swallows a sex change seed, transitions into a man, and then realizes with fearful horror that dime museums would love to exhibit him as the freak of all ages and the woman man. Finally, the freak show not only produced disciplined performers and fearful publics, but also vigilant audiences trained in the pleasures of suspicion. So the possibility of being tricked or duped was central to dime museum entertainment, and showmen encouraged audiences to gain pleasure from suspecting, confronting, and unmasking frauds. Performances of sexual and gender ambiguity were particularly susceptible to this suspicion. For example, the bearded lady's combination of feminine dress and masculine facial hair confronted audiences with a fascinating gender dilemma, right? Was this a woman who pushed the female body beyond recognizable femininity, or was it a man in drag? Visitors were encouraged to resolve this dilemma by prodding at flesh, tugging at beards, and demanding to know the bearded lady's marital and maternal status. Freak show managers encouraged this kind of questioning as good for business, and sometimes even staged fake confrontations that ended up in court. In San Francisco, Madsen's manager also went to court to sue his rivals who allegedly featured fake Miss Madsens in their shows. Far from resolving the gender confusion at hand, such events merely reminded audiences of their susceptibility to being duped. As such, freak shows not only reproduced the boundary between permissible and criminal gender displays that was policed by cross-dressing law, they also popularized and democratized it, turning audiences into aware and vigilant judges of possible gender fraud. In drawing these conclusions, though, I want to leave open the possibility that the freak show could have unpredictable effects that cannot be fully explained in terms of discipline. As cultural historian Rachel Adams has argued, freak shows were not only sites of disavowal, where visitors secured a sense of normality through their distance from the freaks on stage, but also sites of identification. Now, she makes this argument when writing about African-American audiences who unmasked racialized freak show characters, such as the missing link, as their friends and neighbors who performed in these roles as a job for pay. In the context of gender freaks, such as Milton Madsen, the politics of identification could take a slightly different turn through identifications and desires that did not relocate the freak within the audience, but attracted the onlooker to the person on stage. Now, to be clear, I face a problem of evidence in backing up this claim, as the voices of those who may have appropriated freak discourse may not have made their way into the archive. However, neglecting this possibility due to insufficient evidence, I think, is just as problematic as raising it unsupported, because it replicates the structure of the archive, amplifying some voices and silencing others. Now, within the archive, the voice of the newspaper reporter is prominent, and a San Francisco Examiner reporter described Madsen's Dime Museum exhibit as follows. Her part will not be a difficult one. She will be faultlessly attired in patent leathers, a handsome dress suit, embroidered linen, and a white tie. She will recline on an easy chair on a little platform and chat with the socially inclined. But whether she will divulge any of the interesting secrets connected with her numerous love episodes is not definitely known. Consequently, I want to end this presentation by imagining the different ways that different audiences may have interacted with Madsen, with fascination and titillation, perhaps, with discomfort and disdain, but also perhaps with identification, attraction, and desire. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Claire. I really enjoyed that. I think there's a lot of really important history here that we don't get to explore too often, especially in the Bay Area. So I'm really glad that we had you here to kind of walk us through some of this, and it's opened up a lot of possible avenues for me to do some additional research. So thank you. We did have a few really great questions in the chat. Tina was asking if, let me go back and find this. Do you feel that some of these laws that you discussed today, or maybe some others, were enacted to as a way to kind of do like a land grab from people, you know, that they would like to exclude or confine, as you mentioned?
Tina, thank you for the question. I wonder, I would love to answer it, but I want to just kind of like clarify. When you talk about it as like a land grab, what specifically do you mean?
Tina, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna unmute you so you can talk if you'd like to, or you can add it to the chat. You can go ahead.
I was thinking of it as a way of clearing out a population they don't like and then acquiring all that land space, like Chinatown, people that are, you know, non-gender conforming, take those areas and then push them out, make them force sell their areas, and just pretty much push the people out and whitewash the area.
Got it. Thank you for the question, Tina, and thanks for clarifying. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely think it was that. I mean, particularly if you look at the anti-Chinese laws, I discussed some of them. There were a slew of other anti-Chinese laws too, and these were really passed in the couple of decades leading up to both state and then federal, like exclusionary immigration laws. So it was kind of before we had exclusionary immigration laws. These like local nuisance laws did a very kind of similar kind of work in terms of trying to remove people, exclude people, prevent people from moving in to kind of like acquire that land. Similarly, if you look at some of the anti-prostitution laws, you can see that they would really designate specific streets. You know, so it would be like, you cannot have houses of prostitution on Berry Street or on Montgomery Street. And those almost always corresponded with an expansion of the kind of like centralized business district. So it was explicitly an attempt to clear out a neighborhood for business development. You're absolutely right. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question, Tina. Thank you. Ava would like to know if you know if any arrests were fought in court and won in the favor of the accused.
That's a great question. Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of arrests were fought in court, and sometimes the person who was arrested won, though that could mean different things. So like I said, a really wide range of people were arrested. And if the arrestee, you know, showed up in court in a very kind of like gender conforming way. So this would be if a woman was arrested for wearing men's clothing and showed up in court dressed incredibly feminine and just kind of like pled ignorance of the law and said, I was doing it as a joke. Right? It's like, I didn't know, this was just me having fun with my friends. I didn't know it was a bad thing. I'm not like one of those people who does this all the time. And if it was very apologetic, then often the charges would be dropped. If somebody did not do that, if they really insisted, like, no, I have a right to wear these clothes, this is how I feel, you know, then that rarely was successful. There were some interesting cases at the end of the 19th century, when women were wearing men's clothing and claiming the legal right to do so as part of a sort of feminist movement. And there was one fascinating case where the judge gets into incredible detail about how much material a pair of pants can wear that a woman can legally claim them. So it got really into kind of like how narrow or wide the pants were, whether it would count as sort of women's pants or men's pants.
Yeah. I had a question kind of in the similar vein. You talked a lot about the people who were often penalized and, you know, taken underground to be, you know, these kind of performers. They were typically poor, lower class immigrants, that kind of thing. Did you have a sense from your research that people in the upper classes and the more wealthy, like obviously they participated in cross-dressing, like it's silly to think that they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Was that taking place only in private, or were there spaces that were permissible for them to do that because of their status?
That's a really interesting question. So most of the cases that so I have to back up a little bit. So as you may know, you know, the vast amounts of sort of public records from San Francisco from this period were destroyed in the earthquake, right? So I had to kind of like recreate arrest histories through newspaper records, and I was able to recreate, I think, around like 3/4 of those arrested, and almost all of those appeared to be of people of like lower class background. Now, I don't have the full record, so it's possible that people of like more upper class backgrounds were arrested and those arrests weren't reported in the newspaper, or they just weren't arrested. So it's kind of hard to tell, but yeah, of the cases that I was able to find, it was almost all kind of like regular people. It's interesting in terms of the public-private thing. There was debate both in the press and in courtrooms over what counted as private versus public space, and particularly whether bars and like nightclubs were public or private. And there was this one case of a person in the 1890s who was arrested in a bar performing as a female impersonator on stage, because there were like drag bars in San Francisco at that time, and was arrested while performing on stage, and the charges were dropped because when you were on stage, that was seen as private. However, the moment that person stepped off of the stage and started moving through the audience, it was deemed a public space and they could be arrested.
Interesting. Okay. Maybe another option to dig in somewhere.
Yeah.
Additional research somehow, but like you said, those records make it tough. Okay, so Rowan, who is our collections assistant at Camron-Stanford House, has a very wonderful question as normal. Have you identified any correlation between on-stage cross-dressing, eminently popular in the vaudeville scene, and law enforcement, or was this space non-normative enough to dissuade law enforcement from taking these queer performances as serious?
That's a great question. So one of the chapters of the book looks at these different kind of like entertainment venues, and the Freak Show is one of them. But another site that I look at is vaudeville, and, you know, really try to sort of tease apart this seeming contradiction of at the same time that people are being arrested and sent to jail on the street, on the vaudeville stage, including in San Francisco, right? You have these sort of male impersonators, female impersonators who are being embraced as sort of family entertainment. And there are other people who've kind of analyzed, looked at vaudeville cross-dressing in much more detail and have sort of made the argument that the context of vaudeville, presented a lot of that kind of those gender crossings as kind of like magical illusion. It was kind of like, wow, that somebody can transform themselves. Isn't that fascinating? But it wasn't threatening in the same way as on the street. One of the things that's interesting to me is that the chief of police, there was this chief of police called Jesse Cook. I forget the exact years he was the chief of police, but he was really obsessed. He was really into vaudeville, and he was really into theatrical drag. And his scrapbooks are actually at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, those archives. And in there, you have pictures of people who he oversaw their arrests. So there were all of the mugshots of people who get arrested under cross-dressing law. And then on the next page, there are his postcards of vaudeville male and female impersonators. And he even performed himself in drag as part of a local theatrical troupe while overseeing the highest period of arrests for people cross-dressing on the streets. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. A lot.
And it kind of just, it just gets it that it's not the act itself. It's not it's the context in which it occurs and the meanings that get associated with it.
Yeah, when you were talking about that a little bit, I was thinking also of what is it called, the Hasty Pudding Club from Harvard, and that like whole gender performance sphere that they had, and how it was kind of an opportunity for people to yes, it was performance, but it was also an opportunity for people to kind of experiment with, gender roles and gender play and that kind of thing. So I'm curious if maybe there's some mishmash there to think about. Okay, so Zoe is asking if you have any sense of a prevalence of women versus men being discovered as cross-dressing and penalized.
It's like somewhat like, again, because I didn't have complete records, I can't say with confidence. Like, of people reported in the newspaper, it was around 50-50. It was a pretty even split.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. A whole lot of people are asking, when did these laws end?
So that's so they stayed on the books until the 1970s, and actually they became a really central tool for policing like queer and trans communities in the mid 20th century. It's actually how I first became interested in them. I was looking at kind of like 1950s, 1960s oral histories around like lesbian and gay communities, and I would see like in New York, in San Francisco, in various cities, that the police would raid, like queer and trans bars, and they would arrest people, but they would do these like underwear checks, where if you had to be wearing 3 items of clothing of the correct sex, or you would be arrested under these cross-dressing laws. So and then I looked and found that they had this much longer history that went back 100 years. But yeah, they stayed on the books until the 1970s. And I began to do research into this, but I kind of dropped it. So if anybody's interested, actually at the San Francisco Public Library, they have boxes of all these old like community, like newspapers and pamphlets, like of like local queer groups documenting arrests in the 1970s. They went on for a really long time.
Gosh, the 1970s.
And in Oakland, actually, and in Oakland, only till like, I want to say like 5 or 10 years ago, they stayed on the books. They weren't enforced, but stayed on the books.
Yeah, wow, that's surprising, but also not. I guess laws take a long time to get edited like that. Okay, so another question from Aaron is, how was lesbian sexual activity criminalized during this time, or was it?
That's a great question. I mean, okay, so most basically it was not. There weren't any specific laws criminalizing lesbian sexual activity. And one of the reasons I'm also like hesitating a little is that also the category of lesbian wasn't really in play at that time. I mean, women were having sex with women, and that's very clear. And it's actually one of the things that I was like pleasantly surprised by, is that you can find evidence of that in like the local newspapers, that are, you know, that was something that was going on. Like, but there weren't specific criminal laws around that.
Interesting. Okay. Lisa, who is one of our docents, is asking if Matson is related to the Matson shipping family. Not sure if you know about that.
I don't know. I do not know. I mean, my guess would be not, only in that I got fairly obsessed with Matson, and really tried to kind of like piece together as much as I could about his life, and particularly what happened later on. And I didn't come across any sign of that. Doesn't mean it's not true, but I don't think so.
Alrighty. And maybe this might be our last question. We'll see how it goes. Sinclair is asking in the Q&A, this is a very good question. I know there is a debate among historians about whether or not to use they, them pronouns for people who are deceased and didn't use they, them in their lifetimes. And what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really, really great question. And it's one I've been thinking a lot about lately. I actually, personally, I like it. I like that. I did not do it in my book. So my book came out, you know, a while ago, and by the time it got around to the time of like the final edits, somebody was like, hey, you know, maybe you should do that. And so it's not in my book, but not because I would, if I wrote the book now, I would do that. I think, and I understand, as a historian, kind of like, I understand the problems of, you know, taking contemporary categories and imposing them on past experiences. It's like why I'm, you know, I wouldn't want to describe anybody in the past, you know, who's in my study as like trans or as non-binary per se, because those categories were not available. I try to describe them in the categories that were available to them. Right? But that said, there's a real difficulty in writing histories where you have to use gendered pronouns. So I don't want to, it was so for some people in my study, like with Matson, it was really clear that he identified as a man. So it was clear that I was going to refer to him as he. But for many of the other people in my study, it was not clear how they would have identified, right? So I would face this pronoun issue, and I would now use they as a way to refer to people. It's tricky, but I think that's the best solution.
I like that. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, one last question I found popped up from Emily. Not sure if this was asked, but if you know, do you know what age was the youngest to get arrested or caught? I don't know. I do know that there was some case, it was not in San Francisco, a strange case where like a child was arrested under cross-dressing law. They had like, and then they claimed that they had been like sleepwalking in like, you know, their mom's like nightgown or something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, most of the people seem to be, you know, when age was listed, most people were in their early 20s. It seemed, because people would get arrested when they were like coming home from bars and clubs. There were a few people who were much older too. Yeah, and again, like you said, a lot of those records are probably hard to come by these days, so we might not be able to ever know that. Yeah. But yeah, all right, well, those were some really great questions. I think some good discussion there. And if anyone has any other questions, you can feel free to pass them on to me, and I'll try to help. Maybe Claire would be willing to help answer them if anything comes up after you've thought about the discussion a little bit more. I know sometimes that happens, so feel free to send those over. A few things to mention before we go, if you're sticking around. But first, yes, of course, thank you, Claire, for so much. I can't believe I didn't say that. Maybe I did, but just thank you again. I really, really appreciate you being here, and it was a really wonderful presentation, so thank you. But a couple things really quick before everyone pops off. If you were here before the presentation started, you probably saw our slideshow going on, and we do have a great event called The Secret Garden that will be taking place at the Camron-Stanford House on August 22nd. This is a vendor market with Victorian-inspired wares from local makers and creators. It's organized by the Menagerie Gallery, who organizes these kinds of markets throughout the Bay Area, and they're always really fun. So there's going to be music and food and all kinds of good stuff, and you're encouraged to come in your best Victorian costumes if you'd like to. And also your admission and some other activities during that event will support the Camron-Stanford House. So I hope to see all of you there. Tickets for that are on sale, and you can find information on our website, which is www.cshouse.org. Also, after a very long year and a half, Camron-Stanford House is finally back open again. So if you stop by, you'll have a chance to experience our brand new self-guided tour and explore the Tattooed and Tenacious Inked Women in California's History exhibit, which is a lot of fun. And our website does have information about our current hours and protocols and all of that. On that note, Tattooed and Tenacious Inked Women in California's History will be open through the end of October. And I do recognize that not everyone is totally comfortable with visiting public spaces at the moment, and many of you are also from out of town. But the good news is that the exhibit does have a companion virtual exhibit. So you can check out the exhibit content from home, which is really great. And that is also on our website, which is www.cshouse.org. So I think that's all I have for announcements. So thank you all again for being here today and continuing to support the Camron-Stanford House. You're all so appreciated. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you next time. And thank you again, Claire, so much.
Thank you. It was really nice.
Yeah, have a good night.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.